Welcome to the Lawyering Peace interview series, where we explore the art of diplomacy and the legal frameworks that underpin peace processes. You are listening to our special mini-series focused on peace negotiations and peace building in Ukraine. Join us as we hear from prominent figures who have played pivotal roles as lawyers, negotiators, and diplomats in the quest for peace in Ukraine. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In recent months, there has been significant movement regarding negotiations to end Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. With our guests, we explore some of the key issues and challenges that will arise during negotiations and explore possible options for tackling these issues head on. You'll hear from Ukrainian and international experts on issues ranging from territorial integrity and post-conflict elections to negotiating security guarantees, justice, and reparations. Today, I am honored to welcome Dr. Ivan Horodyskyy, Vice President of the Ukrainian Bar Association and the Director and Co-founder of the Unfreezing Center for Law and Politics, where he manages projects relating to compensation for Ukrainians for damages caused by Russian aggression. Ivan is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council here in Washington, D.C. Ivan is recognized as one of the leading lawyers in Ukraine in the practice area of compensation for war damages. In this episode, we'll discuss the issue of reparations for Russia's extensive war damage in Ukraine, as well as the closely related issues of frozen Russian assets and post-war reconstruction. Now, since Russia's 2022 full-scale invasion, Ukraine and its allies have called for Russia to bear responsibility for its illegal acts, including making reparation, to widespread international support. Notably, significant challenges lie ahead in negotiating reparations for Ukraine. What might a compensation mechanism look like? How should reparations be funded? What role should Russian frozen assets play? And how can Russia be made to pay for its war damages? With Ivan, we will explore these questions and more and consider the challenges and strategies for future negotiation of reparations for Ukraine. Ivan, welcome to the program.
Hello.
Well, let's begin. Since Russia's invasion, there has been broad international agreement that Russia is fully responsible for the consequences of its aggression, including a responsibility to compensate Ukraine for all war damages. Indeed, Russia's frozen assets have been intended to serve as leverage in any peace negotiations to ensure Russia's adherence to its legal obligations, including the obligation to pay reparations to Ukraine. So, Ivan, for any of our listeners less familiar with the law of reparations, can you walk us through the legal principle which essentially says that a country must pay reparations for damage caused by its illegal act? Make us smart on reparations.
Thank you very much for this question. So first of all, it's needed to be pointed out that before 1945, reparation for war damages were mainly considered as kind of indemnity for the winner by the cost of the loser of the war. And this was, the reparations were part of the peace agreements after the end of the war. And they were imposed by the winner party, following the old Roman maxim "vae victus." The reparations aimed to cover the winner's costs in the amount established through the negotiations after the end of the war and were fairly limited by the interests of just one of the parties. This approach has changed over the next decades. The fact of victory of one or other party is still of importance for the practical implementations of the decisions on reparations, but the decisions themselves are primarily passed not due to the fact of the victory or defeat, but as a compensation for the consequences of the violations committed during the armed conflict. This vision corresponds to the principle of the international law stated in the decision of the Permanent Court of International Justice in the Horodyskyy factory case of 1927. This was a case between Germany and versus Poland. And in this famous case, tribunal stated that it is a principle of international law and even a general conception of law that any breach of or an engagement involves an obligation to make reparation in an adequate form. However, it is most probably difficult to find any other field where these principles is so difficult to bring to life than post-war settlement. And we see many precedents after the wars when reparations are negotiated for the long time. As a result, they are not paid at all. And on the other hand, there are only few successful examples when the reparations are really negotiated, awarded, and paid as a compensation for the violations of the international law. This is very briefly introduction into the law of reparations or kind of background of war reparations.
Ivan, thank you for that explanation, because everyone talks about reparations and they tend to gloss over the fact that there's a long history of reparations back from the Roman Empire days, and that there's even an International Court of Justice decision on reparations. As you indicated, there's also frequently a role for the United Nations in securing reparations as a result of conflict. Now, in previous instances, the Security Council has played a key role in ordering the payment of reparations, as we saw, for example, when the UN Security Council set up the Compensation Commission following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. However, our listeners are probably likely familiar with the fact that the Security Council is experiencing a period of paralysis at the moment, especially with Russia being a veto-wielding member of the Security Council. And now, while less powerful and not able to act under Chapter 7, the UN General Assembly doesn't suffer from this same paralysis or same gridlock. And the UN General Assembly has already declared via a resolution that Russia must bear the legal consequences of its internationally wrongful acts, including making reparations to Ukraine. And as well, the Council of Europe has set up a register of damage for Ukraine as a prelude to paying reparations and compensation. Can you walk us through what the General Assembly has in mind with respect to its call for international reparations? And talk to us a little bit more about the Council of Europe's register of damage for Ukraine.
Yes, thank you very much. It's an excellent question. So first of all, practically immediately after the illegal Russian invasion against Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, United Nations General Assembly called an extraordinary session during which a number of resolutions, as for now there are 6 or 7 resolutions, were adopted. And in these resolutions, Russian aggression is condemned to be a violation of the international law, and some very practical aspects of the aggression and the situation around Ukraine are considered. One of these aspects were reparations. And on November 14th, 2022, a resolution of the United Nations General Assembly ES 11/5 has passed. And in these resolutions, there was a recognition that Russia should pay for all damages caused by its illegal aggression. And there was a recognizing that Russia's breaches of international law and the support for the establishment of the future international mechanism for compensation for Ukraine. So this is a kind of good result. The bad context is that it was the second least supported resolution Ukraine during this extraordinary session. It's the second least. Only 93 or 94 member states have supported this resolution. So this means that this question is very compensation to Ukraine, to Ukrainians for the war damages and separation in general is very sensitive for many countries, for many parties, and it's little bit less hard for Russia to convince different countries, different states, member states, to avoid supporting this, especially this position. I was talking with the representatives of Ministry of Justice of Chile, for example, which is very supportive for Ukraine as a state. But they were saying that their perception of the reparations process for Ukraine is that it's all just about money. So in this case, Russia's information war, Russia's propaganda is doing a job to discredit a general idea of reparations to Ukraine. The second political thing which is very needed to understand that United Nations General Assembly has a very limited powers and opportunities to establish some practical mechanisms of reparations to Ukraine, to ensure these reparations. This resolution was a very big political gesture, and yes, it's very valuable from the legal point of view, because in all the next documents, all the next negotiations, Ukraine has referred and is referring to this resolution. So it is very important. But no further practical steps can be done. I heard sometimes the idea that this reparations mechanism can be established also by the decision of General Assembly. And in this resolution, the General Assembly should authorize the Secretary General to sign an agreement with Ukraine on establishment of such international compensation mechanism. But as we all can see during the last year, the political background and current Secretary General, I don't believe that he is ready to take this decision, even if such resolution will pass. In this situation, Ukraine needs to find another institutional background, institutional platform to set up international compensation mechanism. Such an institutional platform is, as for now, a Council of Europe. A Council of Europe is a regional, it's very important to understand, regional organization. Yes, there are many observer states from other continents, but generally it's a European organization. And from the very beginning of full-scale Russian aggression, its position against Russia was very strong. Russia was excluded from the Parliamentary Assembly, and later on, Russia has decided to leave Council of Europe in a wall. And so currently, Russia is not a member of the Council of Europe, and that's why, also due to that, the Council of Europe has decided to make all possible efforts to support Ukraine in preserving reparations, in ensuring reparations. The first step, besides a number of resolutions, the first practical step has been done on May 17th, 2023, when in Reykjavik, a framework agreement was concluded between Ukraine and member states of the Council of Europe on the establishment of the Register of Damages. Register of Damages will become or should become a first essential element of the future international compensation for Ukraine. This step means that Ukraine, at the first stage, wants to gather all the claims, wants to gather all the evidences, because all claims are submitted together with evidences from natural persons, from business companies, from the state, other persons. And with this gathered materials, with proofs of thousands and thousands of Russians' violations and crimes, to move further with establishment of the next elements, including compensation fund, and to ask for the next decisions, including the confiscation of the frozen Russian assets.
Ivan, let's pick up on that last note that you made about the confiscation of the Russian frozen assets. A key debate has centered around how the reparations for Ukraine might be funded. And a number of commentators have suggested that the 300 billion in frozen Russian assets could be used to fund the reparations for the destruction caused by the Russian war of aggression. Now, given the likelihood that Russia will, in future peace negotiations, refuse to pay reparations given their behavior during this conflict throughout, this could be a very valuable source of revenue for paying those reparations. What proposals have been made in the last 3 years regarding the use of these Russian frozen assets? And how might such proposals be woven into the peace negotiations that are occurring between Ukraine and Russia? Or should this question of separate reparations and frozen assets be separate? And can it be separate from the peace negotiations?
Yeah. So first of all, when we are talking about this billions of the frozen Russian assets, we are talking about the sovereign funds. So these are reserves of the Russian central bank, which were deposited in different currencies in different countries. The main part of this sum, around 210 billions of the US dollars, were deposited in the EU, especially in the two EU clearing banks. It's Euroclear in Belgium and Clearstream in Luxembourg. And currently they are frozen under the decisions of the European Commission. So currently, and it's very important for the understanding, for the logic of the next what process, that the EU holds the key, holds the wallet and holds this money. And EU is a key administrator of the other frozen assets. To have broader understanding that, for example, in the United States, according to the last and many times repeated information, only 6 billions of the Russian sovereign assets are frozen. So it's not the biggest part of it. The rest of it is frozen in other G7 states, in Switzerland, in other jurisdictions. When we are talking about the discussions and the debate about future of these assets has begun from the very beginning of the Russian aggressions. And from the first weeks and months, Ukraine insisted that this money should be used in the interests of Ukraine and Ukrainians to compensate war damages and to finance reconstruction of the country. At the very beginning, there was a number of articles in foreign media where Ukrainian officials, including member of parliament, minister of justice, they were saying that it's very easy to confiscate this money, and in a couple of weeks or couple of months, this money will be available to Ukraine. Unfortunately and obviously, this was a very, so to say, primitive perception of the problem, because yes, Russia has committed a grave breach of international law, of all essential and foundational norms of principles of international law. But still, the great wall of the sovereign immunities is very hard to climb and is very hard to destroy. So there are very little precedents when courts and states have evaded sovereign immunities, and in any of these precedents was dealing with the amount of hundreds of billions of the US dollars. So it's a very huge amount for these cases. So this money remained frozen, and the position which was taken by the G7 countries and which was repeated many, many times, that this money will remain frozen until Russia compensates all the damages inflicted by its aggression against Ukraine. This formula, which was, as I mentioned, it was repeated in every annual G7 resolution except this year resolution, because there was no resolution at all. And it was repeated in every EU Parliament, EU Commission resolution. So this formula envisaged that for the holders, administrators of these assets, the most preferable scenario is that one day Russia and Ukraine are sitting at the table and they are discussing reparations. Russia voluntarily agrees to pay reparations, and then when reparations are paid, this money would be unfrozen and transferred back to Russia. So this is the easiest way to avoid any discussions and any tough decisions regarding sovereign immunities and other things. But of course, this vision that Russia will discuss reparations, it's so to say very too optimistic, because when you will search or Google for any political statements concerning reparations, all Russian officials were saying no, and it was very strictly no. And there were even ideas that Ukraine should pay reparations to Russia from their side. So in this case, European Union has started to think about how to use this money for the benefit of Ukraine. On November 30, 2022, Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, has said that Commission is working on some mechanism or formula how to use these assets to take proceeds from them and transfer it to Ukraine. This was a promise, but this promise was implemented and was executed, but it had taken more than a year to discuss different formulas were discussed. Some were suggesting to invest this money. Some were suggesting to issue an obligations and gather secured by these assets and to gather money, and this money should be paid to Ukraine. But later on, in February and then in April 2024, European Union had established a special mechanism which envisages that, first of all, that interests obtained from these assets, and we are talking about the amount from 3 to 5 billions of the US dollars per year, is not a part of the whole amount, and it's not protected by the sovereign immunities. So the European Union made a very historical shift in the practice of sovereign immunities. That's yes, that there is a main body of the assets, but all the interests and for the profits are not protected by the sovereign immunities. And secondly, it has decided that all profits which will be obtained after February 15th, 2024, they will be 90% of them will be transferred to Ukraine and used for the interests of Ukraine and Ukrainians. This was a first practical step, but the next step, and also practical, was done in the next months. And in July 2024, G7 countries have agreed to issue a loan for Ukraine, a kind of reparations loan, within the special extraordinary revenues mechanism for Ukraine, so-called euro loans, which envisage that countries in different proportions will provide to Ukraine a loan in the amount of 50 billions of the US dollars. And this loan will be repaid not by Ukraine, but from this interests proceeds from the assets from the Russian central bank, which in practice means that Ukraine has received all the interest gathered in 2024. So it's kind of 4 billions of the US dollars. And later on, it will, during the next year and this year and the next year, it will receive again 100 US dollars immediately. But also during the next 10 or 15 years, there will be no money for Ukraine from these assets. And this, because all the process will be repaid to the countries which are loan providers. This move was justified because even in that time, everyone understood that situation in the United States, the major donor as for the moment, political situation can change, and Ukraine will need money in the shorter run and midterm run. So this loan, a reparation loan, was to ensure that financial stability Ukraine, macroeconomic stability Ukraine during the at least couple of years. Currently, so this situation, some is talking that there is a problem because currently, from their perspective, we cannot talk about the confiscation of the frozen Russian assets till this reparation loan is repaid to the G7 countries. So until only after that, all the proceeds from the Russian as they will cover all the expenses of this loan. So it can happen in 10 years or 15 years or so. Only then the confiscation of these assets can be considered. So this one point of view, of course, it it doesn't take into account that, for example, part of this assets can be used to pay the loan and rest transferred to Ukraine, but there are different scenarios. Second, your question was about current peace negotiations, the problem or question about confiscation of Russian assets. As for now, there are only some rumors that, yes, that in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, the issue of confiscation of Russian assets, their future, was debated. But no official statements and no versions, even from the insiders, how there's only one. I think we will discuss it further. But the main challenge in this is that, as I mentioned, the main administrator of the frozen Russian assets is the European Union. And currently, the European Union is not at the table of negotiations. There are the United States, Russian Federation, Ukraine, but not the European Union. And politically, of course, I have doubts that the European Union will automatically accept any decision concerning these assets, accept and implement, which is taken without their knowledge and participation. So, first of all, from my opinion, any practical decisions concerning confiscation or other usage of these assets can, within the peace negotiations, can be seriously discussed only when the European Union is participating in these negotiations. And currently, politically, that these assets are the key for the European Union to enter these negotiations.
Well, Ivan, let's pick up on that a little bit. So the European Union has control of these assets. They're not yet part of the peace process. What might happen if Russia agrees to a ceasefire and subsequent renewals of the ceasefire, but says, hey, look, we'll only negotiate a lasting peace with Ukraine when the European Union unfreezes our assets? Can you walk us through what the Ukrainians and what the Europeans might think about that if the Russians condition entering into a peace process on the unfreezing of assets? What are the arguments for and against doing so?
So Ukraine definitely is against. The Ukrainian government is against, and the main argument for Ukraine is very obvious. Russia, there's only less than 1%, from my opinion, chance that Russia will voluntarily agree even to discuss reparations, or to pay it. The chances are even less. So that's why, if we still want that reparations of Ukraine should become a successful precedent, as in case of the United Nations Compensation Commission for Kuwait, and the frozen Russian assets are the only practical and viable source to finance the reparations. If they are unfreezed and transferred back to Russia, the chances that reparations will be paid within the reasonable time are becoming less and less. Of course, other mechanisms of financing reparations can be discussed. So we can take an experience of the United Nations Compensation Commissions and to discuss these fees on the export of Russia's oil and gas, as it was in case of Iraq. It's possible. But currently, these alternatives were not discussed and they were not even considered. So in this case, the second thing, but understand that we are living in the world of realpolitik. And there, I don't want to be in the place of our president or our Minister of Foreign Affairs, because Russia can make different suggestions. For example, so they are holding in captivity thousands of Ukrainian citizens. So civilians captured in different occupied territories, and which are in the Russian jails with no legal grounds and like hostages, prisoners of wars, and Russia is treating them as criminals. And there are even some tribunals and processes against them, and so they are not treated as prisoners of wars. So, and I can really imagine a situation when Russia tells, look, you want an exchange of prisoners of wars and persons in captivities, and it's one of the red lines for Ukraine, and which was stated by the Ukrainian president recently. You want these people back? You want this exchange? Okay. Our assets should be unfrozen. Unfrozen. If doesn't mind, we will prosecute them, and they spend in our jails 10, 15, 25 years independently. So if this choice is on the table, as I'm saying, it's very hard, morally and ethically, very hard to discuss it. The other choice can be territories, the other choice can be many security guarantees, others. So Russia definitely will trade this card, definitely. But the choice, I don't know if it is acceptable or can be acceptable for Ukraine, but it definitely will be very hard.
No, I think, Ivan, you've laid out very clearly how it is that the Russians might strategically use a request to have these assets unfrozen and some of the cards that they hold in terms of the children, the civilians, the prisoners of war. And it wouldn't be beyond the Russians to behave in that type of utilitarian manner. Let me ask about another issue that's arisen recently, is this notion of this idea that some of these frozen Russian assets could be used for reconstruction in the territories of Ukraine currently occupied by Russia. What are your thoughts on that? What are some of the pros and cons of those proposals that are floating around?
If we are talking about from the arithmetical or mathematical point of view, yes, or theory of games, it's always better to get a part, at least a part or major part, than to get nothing, or to get some part with less efforts, or get some part right now, not sooner than later. So it's if we're taking a pragmatic perception. But from the moral, legal perception, there are big risks for Ukraine, political risks, legal risks, because the general consensus, the general political, legal, international legal consensus after February 24th, 2022, is that Russia is responsible for all violations and damages caused on the Ukrainian territory after the start of the full-scale invasion. So if we're talking about reparations, there is no, so to say, adversarial process needs that you should prove that this damage was inflicted by the actions of the Russian armed forces, of the Ukrainian armed forces. There is a consensus that Russia started this, so Russia is responsible. All the further events are outcomes of Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. So this is a major point. If such approach, which was, according to Reuters, discussed in Riyadh, that Russia agrees to that this money are used for the reconstruction or reparations in the interest of Ukraine, but some part of it is used for the reconstruction of the temporary occupied territories, which, as for the moment, probably still will be remained in case of peace agreement this year or in the longer run. So this can mean and can be interpreted as a partial recognition of Ukraine as of its responsibility of some damages or violation caused in their territories. That not only Russia is fully responsible, but also partially Ukraine. Yes, it's not a direct recognition, and it's not this interpretation is not so obvious. But strategically, this move definitely will be used by Kremlin in the longer run, in some discussions, in some information wars, etc., etc., etc. So from my perspective, and which I'm communicating here in Ukraine, in media, talking in private conversations with my colleagues who work in the government, that these things should not happen. So Ukraine should not agree on this move, because currently Russia is not controlling this money, and this assets as a leverage can be used much more effective way without possessing other risks for Ukraine.
Well, Ivan, you've been very generous with your time. I have one last question for you, and that is, given the evolving nature of basically this rapid movement into a ceasefire, possibly, and peace negotiations, and all the complexities that we've just discussed for the last 45 minutes on using frozen assets for reparations, what is your assessment of, strategically, how best can Europe and Ukraine work to ensure that these 300 billion of frozen assets is used for reparations? What would you be advising, or maybe what you are advising President Zelensky on his strategic approach to securing reparations?
President Zelensky has once said that he has 4 or 5 managers with whom he's always consulting, and I'm not a part of this group of people. So I'm communicating, working with many people who are involved in the reparations track on different levels, different dimensions. Of course, I don't have an access to the prime minister, president, or minister of foreign affairs. So from my point of view, still we are at the moment when, besides political arguments and besides some economical arguments, the major problem for the confiscation of these assets are the sovereign immunities. This position is not always fully accepted in Ukraine. Ukrainians, very emotionally, it's fully understandable. So after 3 years of the horrible war in all parts of Ukraine, all parts were shelled, people were killed by the drones, by the missiles, etc. So Ukrainians are very emotionally saying that, what sovereign immunities? Look, we are in the state of war. We are victims of the illegal aggression. So what are the grounds, what are the facts you need to confiscate these assets? What I'm always saying that Ukraine and Ukrainians government, Ukrainians, they should more carefully work with these arguments. Legal arguments concerning the sovereign immunities, economic arguments, in case of the European Union, it's a fear that the Eurozone and euro as a reserve currency will be at risk. So if 100, 200 billions of the US dollars are confiscated, so other countries like Saudi Arabia or Indonesia, and they have made some signals about that, they will take their reserves from the Eurozone. So yes, this risk is. So Ukraine needs to work with these counter-arguments and listen to them and explain them and so on. As for now, if we're talking about some legal mechanism of legal grounds, how to work with the problem of the sovereign immunities, there is a consensus also among international lawyers, prominent international lawyers, including Dapo Kande, Philip Sands, Philip Zelikow, who is not a lawyer as far as I understand, but he works with this issue, and many others, that this money can be confiscated as a part of collective countermeasures against Russia. So this will be more than justified when state who administer these reserves of the Russian central bank will collectively declare that, look, we have imposed sanctions of Russia, the aggression hasn't stopped, so and freezing of assets is a form of sanctions. So as a next step of the countermeasures, we are confiscating these assets for the reparations to Ukrainians. And if the level of reparations will be less than amount we confiscate, this difference will be transferred back to Russia after the aggression, after all the reparations are paid. So this is the most prominent and the most complex vision how to deal with the sovereign immunities. It was a part of a positional document, a white paper published by a group of people. It was shared among the G7 and the EU governments at the beginning of the 2024. And it's more or less recognized, yes, we can do it. But still there is a need of a political will And of course, the European Union is always thinking that maybe there will be a better moment to do it, or there will be even the best moment to do it or not to do it. And in this case, Ukraine needs to take a very careful approach how to convince our allies to confiscate these assets on the one hand, and on the other hand, to specify a strategic goals how to use these assets in the interests of Ukraine. Unfortunately, when we will look at the statements of the Ukrainian officials, including Prime Minister Shmyhal, President Zelensky, others, there will be a very different and contradictory ideas about how to use this money for the benefit of Ukraine. For example, President Zelensky in November 2024 in Budapest has stated that, look, you have this hundreds of billions of US dollars, give it to us and we will buy weapons. It's okay, it's justified from the short run point of view. On the other hand, Denis Shmyhal, our prime minister, has also stated that this money should be used for the general aim or abstract aim of reconstruction of Ukraine. So reconstruction is very needed, but again, you can make everything. I tell that anything is reconstruction. But unfortunately, on the highest level of our state officials, there are no declarations and there are no statements that this money should be used as a main source of reparations for Ukraine. From my perspective, which I'm also advocating on the different platforms, the best option for the future of these assets and the best option reasoning for this confiscation is a confiscation of these assets with simultaneous transfer of it to the future compensation fund. So currently we have register of damages. This year should be established a compensation claims commission. And the next step should be establishing a compensation fund from which payments should be made to the Ukrainians. So practically the same model which was working in the case of the United Nations Compensation Commission. And if this money are transferred to this fund and furtherly used for the reparations, so first of all, it means it's morally justified. Secondly, in any case, they will serve for the needs of reconstruction of Ukraine. For example, if we're talking about business, there can be set up limits that monies received as a compensation for damages from this compensation fund, they can be used only within the territory of Ukraine. Yes, there can be some exemptions, but it's possible. In case of natural persons, I'm against any such limits because unfortunately, many persons left Ukraine because their houses are destroyed. I don't know if they want to come back. Many of them don't have why to come back because their cities and villages are temporarily occupied. But in case of business, such a pragmatic point of view and economically reasoned can be used. And also, it will be much more easier for the Europeans to explain to themselves, to explain to their citizens, to their business, to their banks, why are they confiscating this money? Because we are confiscating Russian money to buy weapons. Yes, okay, everyone understands this, but still maybe not the best. We are taking this money to use in the interest for the reconstruction of Ukraine. Again, very prominent, very good aim, but again, maybe not so convincing. But we are confiscating this money. We are providing it to the international compensation mechanism in which 26, except Hungary, 26 EU member states are participating. And we are transferring it to the internationally managed and controlled compensation fund, which will pay this money under the decisions of internationally created, established, and consisted of international members Claims Commission. So it's more than a justified aim, and it's more than reasonable from the moral and political point of view. Without that, unfortunately, the reparations to Ukrainians can last, the payments of reparations to Ukrainians can last for the decades. And for me, the worst scenario is that this question of reparations for Ukrainians remains undecided for the decades. Because we currently have many precedents. We have precedents of Poland, who is asking Germany 80 years after the Second World War that you should pay us reparations for this period. And Poland counts trillions of the US dollars to be paid. We have many other examples on the personal level, state level, once the question of reparations appears in decades after. But during these decades, this question spoils the society, spoils the trust of the society to government, spoils the trust of the society to the international community, etc. So why I want, because I'm not fortunately, as for now, I'm not the candidate for the reparations. So no damages, material damages or non-material. There can be, but they're not eligible, or have been done to me. But for me, I want these questions to be decided within a decade or so. It won't be quick, but definitely it should not be left for the decades.
Ivan, thank you for breaking out that distinction between the different ways in which these assets could be used: weapons, reconstruction, reparation, and then the complicated nature of when and how reparations are made. Because you are right, it does spoil the public's trust in the international community, in the government, in the rule of law. Well, Ivan, it's been a real honor and a real privilege to have you on the program. You and your center do amazing work on legal and political questions relating to Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine. And we've been really lucky to have you spend this hour with us, sharing your thoughts and your insights. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a big pleasure for me to join you today.